Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we can be pretty informal because we're an intimate group. Welcome to this session of Data Matters, and we're honored to have Professor Rebecca Nedostup here, who will be presenting on Mirages of Digital Access and the Shaping of History. And She'll be talking today about how, for historians and scholars in numerous other fields, inquiry rests at least as much on access to new sources as on formulating new approaches to known sources. What are the implications for data science and for historical practice when digital repositories do not reflect the full diversity of the materials scholars have come to depend on to advance knowledge? This talk will draw on the field of modern Chinese history, where for privacy and politics, digital access to archives and other key materials is uneven. And Professor Nedostup will be discussing some implications for data-driven research, for teaching, and for the general understanding of a diverse historical past. So just to say a few words about Professor Nedostup, she's a historian of 20th century China and Taiwan in the departments of History and East Asian Studies at Brown. And she works on displacement and emplacement, the social and political roles of the living and the dead in times of disruption, and the relationship of transitional justice and historical consciousness. More broadly, she's interested in ritual studies, historic preservation, critical archive studies, and digital ontologies. Between 2015 and 2019, she worked with Maura Dykstra at Yale and other collaborators on Magpie, a project exploring the ethics and methods of creating digital records of research materials that are inconsistently digitized or not at all, subject to access barriers, or simply left on the cutting room floor as part of the scholarly process. And she's currently also faculty director of the Choices program. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Nedostup, and she'll give a presentation, and then we'll have a bit of a back and forth, and then throw it open to the crowd. Great, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you, Aspen, for facilitating everything and for the invitation. I'm going to talk about some of the things that that Professor Case mentioned. I would also have to say that I think a lot of what I was intending to say has been both turned upside down, but then also reinforced by events of the past couple of weeks, both in the emergence of DeepSeek and how that's been treated in the global press, the United States, US press, but also in the moment that we're living right now in the United States, where we are seeing information disappear from our federal government in real time as well. So I also want to say to make a plug for next week, Love Data Week, and especially the talk that's going to be given by Professor Jing Li as part of that. And she's going to be talking about some of her work about sort of theorizing the Great Firewall and how that creates states of exception for information access and for digital being. So for a very sophisticated version of the talk I'm about to give today, please, please go away there. Sorry. Please attend Professor Lee's talk. And oops. Sorry. So okay. So back where we were. Oh, right. Yeah. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Back where we were. Yes, please. All right. So a kind of note, a self-reflective note about some of the things I'm going to talk about and our current moment. So the people who engage in the China studies field, regardless of where they are in the world, have in documented fashion and somewhat analyzed fashion engage in a process of self-censorship when we are presenting in public. And oftentimes very detailed questions of research access are things that we discuss that among ourselves or behind in like less public settings. And I want to acknowledge that. And also acknowledge that this is not a particular only restricted to this particular field as well. But we are also, especially, I think we can realize this in our current moment in the United States, where we are experiencing censorship, and of the many examples that have emerged in the past few days, the one where uh, the T in LGBT has been dropped from federal sites as a way of attempting to erase the digital existence as well as the physical existence of transgender people and their place in the public world. So this is not a uniquely China studies or Chinese question, but it has been at the forefront of a lot of coverage outside of China of DeepSeek. If you remember the first couple of articles that emerged, there were two emphases. One is this a Sputnik moment in terms of the technological challenge of basically the financial challenge presented by DeepSeek? But then almost immediately, people went on and started to search for the terms that everyone associates with Chinese censorship, right? Tiananmen, Taiwan, et cetera. There are more deeper analyses carried out by others to look at things that do and do not appear on DeepSeek in English when queried in English. Some things appear when there's character substitution in those queries. And we get different results too when queried in Chinese. And I find this kind of interesting to think about in terms of how this problem of DeepSeek has been presented. It reminds me very much of these discussions that come and go about techno-orientalism and how this is shaping the reception of a program like DeepSeek. And then I want to talk a little bit about that, but also talk about how in some ways, it reflects very shared elements of our technological past and present and future. And I'm going to focus in a very kind of non-technical way then on the question of data and how in a number of the larger framing of the challenge of DeepSeek, we often hear it in terms, it's been presented so far in terms of computing capacity, how many chips are needed to power DeepSeek versus to power OpenAI and so on. But I would say that there's a fundamental problem that generative AI clients like OpenAI and DeepSeek share, which is the data set. And that's the most opaque part of generative AI. And I think that as a historian, I'm the most concerned with the data set, with the actual what data is being used to train LLMs, and how that shapes the results that we get. So I'm going to approach it from the data end rather than the technical end. And I think that this is it links in very interesting ways to discussions that have been going on, for example, in anthropology after the so-called ontological turn, wherein anthropologists have been trying to account for a multiplicity of worldviews, but that also has raised very deep and penetrating questions about data, the data with which anthropologists are actually using to understand those different ontologies, and whether the anthropological and ethnographic process itself somehow corrupts the data, or is it actually, is there a way around it? And so I think that if we apply some of these similar questions to the question of large language learning models and and computing, that might be useful. And I'm going to talk particularly about, from my perspective as a historian of modern China, which has been transformed, especially since the 1980s, in what some people call a kind of archives revolution. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means, and then why that is not necessarily that fundamental way of reframing how we think about doing modern Chinese history is strangely muted in the world of digital data. There's not, it's the impact and the digitization are not equally felt. Which I think can generate a really interesting discussion about large language models in the humanities and humanistic social sciences. And do they actually expand our database, or are they analyzing our extant database in a new way? So is it contributing to a kind of recanonization rather than a decanonization or decolonization? The last thing I want to talk about is, again, putting censorship in context and thinking about the kind of additional labor that is entailed in anybody's interaction with technology, from understanding your terms of service to actually being able to interpret and understand hallucinations that come from generative AI models. This is all still relying on human expertise and human labor. And so I think some of the effects of that are actually not that far away from the effects of censorship, in the sense that it takes a broader sort of understanding of the data that is out there and that exists as a way of understanding these results, modifying against them, adjusting, and so on. So just to mention briefly about, and I'm sure that we'll see a lot of more sophisticated analysis of this in the coming months. The approach of to DeepSeek in this country, and this is from today's New York Times, so we've just heard that there's various governmental legislative action thinking about banning DeepSeek on government devices, and so on. This has I think there's a strong element of what a term that came out of media studies, techno-orientalism, which holds that both the places considered Oriental or other, including East Asia, can be considered more technologically advanced and therefore dangerous, but also strangely not advanced. And I think sometimes when we focus on technological advancement and censorship together, we see both of those elements in play. So that's, I think, kind of useful to think about, because I'll give some examples in a moment. We also see that in the world of generative AI, with these kind of new Cold Wars emerging, and it's not just China versus the US, but there are a number of other players as well. At the same time, thinking about from the point of view of data and modern Chinese history. So when I say archives revolution, I'm really talking about the end of what we, conventionally politically call the Cold War, the rapprochement of China with Europe and the United States, and the consequent opening of archives, both to Chinese researchers and to researchers overseas, especially from the mid 1980s on, in the era of opening and reform. And this really transforms the practice of modern Chinese history, especially. It leads to first a new wave of social history, economic history, lately, in more recent years, legal history, and so on. It starts with the opening of general centralized state archives, but then has very quickly spread to the opening of urban archives, of county archives, of a number of different levels. But the key in this reopening, of course, is that that access to archives. This is true everywhere. It's very rare that someone can just like walk into an archive and not like fill out any form about who they are and why they're there. But then it plays out in particular ways in China that they, when this was all analog information, the access is controlled. And it can be controlled through researchers having to shape and present their requests without knowing what the data is. For example, not knowing, having access to a full catalog, or it can also be controlled piecemeal, so that as people make requests, they are denied or approved sometimes. And something that digitization has enabled is a kind of labor saving on the part of archival managers who want to control access, meaning there's been a massive movement to digitize archives. Most of these are not open access in the way that we would consider to be open access, meaning you actually still have to be physically on site and go through the approval process to access the digital records. And you may not be able to download them as digital records. You may only be able to take notes. You may only be able to print, and so on. So this is a kind of incomplete digital revolution in that sense. And then also it relies somewhat, to some extent, on user experience to identify records that archivists might want to control. There's not enough labor power in an archive to actually go through and censor. But when individual users come and ask for a particular record, that may be a way that they identify, okay, this is something that we don't want to give access to, and literally delete it from the catalog. So this is an odd situation where we have digitization not equaling a kind of open access. And I think this has very serious implications for the training of large language models. If those models do not have access in a digital form to this very large bank of material that has essentially been the bread and butter of historians and scholars in humanities and humanistic and social sciences for decades. So what are we missing in what the LLMs are being trained on? Then there's a kind of a related issue, which is a number of other methods of gathering information, some long established, some more recently become popular, emerge. So we have, and I think in any field you could think of a kind of data that does not exist easily in digital form for various reasons. It is a physical object. It is based on ethnographic records, and the accumulated photographs and recordings done by scholars over the years. So we have that on the one hand. We also have the emergence of what some people might call grassroots history, which is the personal or in small groups collection of materials and sharing of materials. And And then there's an individual version, which the scholar Jeremy Brown has termed garbageology, which is basically looking for publications and sometimes personnel records, other kinds of personal data that has been discarded, and that may end up in a flea market or on a book selling site, or sometimes just discarded in the street, and then is collected by interested researchers. And so from all of these, you could see how in the description that there are access issues. There are access issues for these kinds of materials for reasons of privacy. And particularly if we think of ethnographic records, sociological survey results, and so on, there are serious privacy considerations. But it's not something that people are able to sort of openly advertise on the web for the most part, and it's starting to change a little bit. But I have this bunch of material, and wouldn't you like to also see it? So this relies a lot on a certain kind of privilege, in the sense of networks of people who can share a USB stick or can share a drive. And so the extent of someone's personal relationships actually also affects their ability to access materials. So this was sort of one of the fundamental problems that when I was working with Maura Dykstra, Ian Miller, and Paul Viertaler on the Magpie project, we were thinking a lot about this. And we were trying to figure out what is a way actually to create a DOI, to make a permanent record, public record, accessible for these kinds of materials without necessarily making the actual materials digitally immediately accessible, if there were still considerations of privacy and so on. I think a lot, there have emerged a few different platforms that have started to solve that problem. So like we now have Collection Builder, and other ways for people to try to share their digital collections. But I think the top level, like transparency, is still a thorny issue that we haven't really solved. So within this too, I think there are some questions too it raises some questions about like what are archives for, which is a question that historians are always droning on about, or trying to decide and redecide. And I found, so one of the, as I mentioned, there's some new efforts to make this kind of behind the scenes information available. So you can see the China Unofficial Archive site that just was launched not too long ago is one of these, and focused particularly on records related to the intellectual history and the politics of the 1980s and 1970s. And at the same time, there are a lot of official government either releases of archives and a kind of shaping of what archives are for. And an example related to my research, but certainly not the only one, is the interest in releasing particular kinds of archives to demonstrate wartime misconduct, atrocity, and so on. There's an element that I think both these kinds of projects share, which is the kind of like, I guess I would call it like a sunlight principle. Like if you open up archives to the sunlight, it will change the way people think, or it will offer proof of in one direction or another, which is not a bad principle in general. But then I think it still reflects this kind of piecemeal organization. And how many of these kinds of efforts do we actually need to reshape the results that we would get in querying a generative AI model? How much of these are reflected? How much of these might distort what we get from those models as well? And the problem there is, well, there's a couple of problems related to the shaping of LLMs overall. But I would say one of the things that has emerged from this that's really kind of interesting in the China field in particular is that um, the best digital humanities projects are in the early modern, middle period, pre-modern period. They're not in modern Chinese studies or modern Chinese history. And although there are some very good ones, but really the energy has come into thinking about how to apply digital tools and digital analysis to, in some sense, a canon that we already have, a canon of large databases that reflect a long history of the collecting of books by the Chinese imperial government and other entities. For instance, I'm not going to go into more detail of that because then my colleague Cynthia Brokaw, who's an expert in publishing history and the history of the book in China, can say in 2 sentences something much keener than that. But I would say that I don't think that this is an issue. It may be the chronology is a little bit interesting in the China field compared to some other fields where we tend to think of, well, the amount of information and data that's available as time goes on and in the modern period is so much more that therefore that we can learn more with digital tools for the modern period than the pre-modern period. It hasn't quite worked out that way in Chinese studies, and I'd be curious to hear about what other fields that might be the case as well. So we have a lot of great projects that are good at, sometimes they're really turning over new materials, but they're also doing what scholars of the world, the pre-modern and ancient and medieval world have done for decades, which is figuring out how to ask new questions of the text that they already have. And so this is important, but I would say there is a qualitative difference between that and the principle of finding additional new undiscovered archives or alternate texts or sort of overall like decanonization of our data set. So this is kind of something I'd really like to hear people's ideas about is, are digital tools actually participating in this like decanonization effort that has been fundamental to scholarship for the past few decades, or are they inadvertently kind of recanonizing in a way? And do large language models actually help us rethink this question of like, how does the data shape the ontology? What are we taking from archives? Is it, we're taking them as concrete proof, or are we taking them as part of a larger picture? And I think that's an open question still to be answered. I will say the techno-nationalism question is really interesting right now. So on the left, this is from as you can see, LLM that's being developed in Taiwan. And so just to play that quickly again, it's really interesting. The full name is Trustworthy AI Dialogue Engine. And then there's some reference to the importance of Chinese language materials to this in particular. But in traditional Chinese. So there's a distinction between what's being offered by DeepSeek in simplified Chinese and reflecting Taiwan rather than China. And this fits into the overall, I guess, technological direction of the Taiwanese government, especially in the past number of years, which is to emphasize data integrity, fact checking, and Taiwan as a source of these kinds of technologies, as well as the principle. So that's something that sort of exists in direct competition to something like DeepSeek, which is also claiming to create greater facility for Chinese language users as well. And what kinds of information that will generate remains to be seen. We're all playing around with it. We're all finding things, the same kind of like hallucinations, and then things that are actual references that we have been seeing with different other AI models over the past couple of years. To me, one of the interesting things that has come out of thinking about this issue, and also trying to turn it into ways to productively teach data literacy and working with AI in my classrooms, is the sort of realization that there are, I guess, functional similarities between this process of the opacity, the capitalist opacity that that shields the data sets of generative AI clients, and censorship. Either way, we don't know. There's a black box, and we don't know what is in it, what is missing, what is present. And I learned quite a lot about this from some of our librarians too, who pointed out that we were talking about JSTOR, for instance, and why JSTOR topical suggestions like related work suggestions have become so lousy in the past couple of years. Like really, so like any JSTOR user will have seen a deep decline in that. And that's JSTOR has its own proprietary algorithm. We don't know what's behind that either. And that has been shaping our results. And that's supposed to be the gold standard, right, for undergrads, is to go look in JSTOR. And in this this article by Sharon Bach, it points out, and this is already from a couple of years ago, but there are some inequities expressed in the recommendations of related material that come through JSTOR. So there's a kind of misrepresentation, and they were looking particularly on for materials on the history of race and the history of women. So that's a problem that in some ways, the end user, us, we have to figure out how to work around, but we can't fundamentally solve because we don't work for JSTOR and we don't know what's going into their algorithm. But maybe if we train more like historically or liberal arts minded programmers to go work for JSTOR, then they might help us. And in a way, some of the effects are kind of similar to what scholars have been tracking for a number of years now. And this is an article by Glenn Tiffert from the American Historical Review that specifically traced the disappearance of articles on particular subjects from CNKI, which is like the main Chinese language secondary source model. So it's the Chinese language JSTOR in essence. And so I'm curious, it's like the results are, I think, to the end user are quite similar in both of these cases. So this is a plugin and invitation for, yes.
I just wanted to ask previously.
Yeah.
When you take a system like JSTOR or one of its Chinese analogs, there's the algorithm they use to present those to you. There's their own database of citation network. Then there's the citation network and the PDFs themselves whenever the author And so just looking at these, it made me think you mentioned changing the algorithm, but that abstract on the right says they're actually redacting holdings.
Yes.
I'm wondering, are they even doing that at the level of editing the PDFs, or is it in principle possible to take those PDFs and look for things that are now missing that should have been there because someone referenced them? Is there any way to see what has been redacted?
Yes, and actually, that's what the author does in this article. But then that raises then the question of, so if you find out what's missing, then what he describes is like he did it by tracking down and comparing also hard copy publications, journals with what's available in the system itself. So I think that this, one of the implications is, and I think this maybe like goes back to labor too. So it's not necessarily that's disappeared from the world forever, but so you can trace it and track it, but then it relies on the individual expertise of the person who is doing that work. And it relies on their access to alternate versions. So Harvard Library has addressed this partly through like replication and redundancy. They have a number of subscriptions to a number of different databases for Chinese language materials as a way of getting around that. We don't have that financial capacity at Brown, so we're kind of relying on this one. This is like one of our main repositories. And there may be a number of other places where that access is even more limited. So I guess that was kind of what I'm thinking about. But you're right that they are in some ways, they're different levels of access of the information and kind of like hiding or like shadowing the information, maybe. Yeah. So to sort of wrap up, and then we can have more discussion too. I was just discussing with Holly, I'm helping organize a reading group this semester around some of these issues. Access, we're at this moment, we may change it, called Access, Labor, and Equity in Digital Asian Studies. So one of the things we want to look at is, of course, the problem of censorship. And there's this great new book, Redacted, which talks about this and specifically with regard to East Asian and Central Asian studies. But one of my colleagues also pointed out that labor is the question of labor and digital labor, and the labor that increasing digitization entails is something that we ought to be looking at as well. So this kind of goes back to my, connects to my previous response just now. So if anyone's interested, please feel free to contact me. You're welcome to join. The last thing I want to talk about is teaching. And again, I owe a lot to data science and Linda Clark for helping me develop some of this. So, both initially through participating as in the data science workshop, but then also for the ability to work with a data science fellow last year, Naphat Pradhan. He helped me essentially think about how we can take some of these questions around data literacy, pull them out. So think about a protocol for testing out generative AI clients based on what the students were learning in the particular class. But also with the sound advice of Neve McGuigan and Emily Ferrier in the library, they pointed out that this is actually a data literacy issue, and because of questions like what is suggested in JSTOR and the differences that everyone notices between Bruno and results in other databases and so on, that this is better framed as a data literacy, like how do you actually learn how to utilize these different tools kind of exercise. So this is what we developed. So she was in the audience and she was my TA when we worked, first tested out this assignment, which I'm glad to share with anyone. And I'd welcome her comment on how well it worked. We realized that actually that in a subsequent class, when I did not include this project, the overall educational experience was not as good. So actually, I'm really glad that we did this. Essentially what we did was to kind of walk through students through how they might get different results in queries about our subject matter, which was Chinese socialist history, in different data sources or databases, and actually how do you understand why you're getting those results and how do you compare them. So we asked people to work in groups, and they would be comparing Bruno and a generative AI client and JSTOR, Google Scholar, a bigger catalog, union catalog like WorldCat or HathiTrust, and then maybe a specialized Chinese a language database or a Chinese language source or Asian studies. So then, and having people work in a group facilitated this because people had different skills, language skills, but also we had students who are bring CS skills to this as well as humanities skills. And we walk them through identifying keywords, which is almost, serves a testing capacity for the class, but also going through different sources, figuring out what is behind different sources, how they are created. So I think I'm going to use some version of this in most of my classes going forward, and maybe not quite as large and elaborate, but it was really, really helpful, both for me and I think for the students as well. So that is where I will end. I think we have a lot that we could potentially talk about, and I look forward to hearing your comments.